Hey there. Tonight we slip into the pale, powdered hush of a medieval chamber where the fire crackles low. The rushes smell faintly of lavender and something less lovely, and a polished shard of bronze doubles as a mirror. You sit before it, face bathed in candlelight and quiet expectation. The maid approaches with a cloth-wrapped bundle, and you already know what's inside your Lee paste, your crushed chalk, your touch of rouge. Not because it's fun, because it's survival. You see, in this world, beauty is everything but not the glowing, smiling kind. No. You're aiming for something softer, something colder. Tonight, beauty means looking like you've just stepped out of the afterlife. Fragile, bloodless, delicate as a saint carved from ivory. The standards are brutal, but the consequences of ignoring them even worse. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're joining us from somewhere far away or just a few blocks over, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lift the lid on your little wooden box. Inside jars, powders small, brushes, a few bundled herbs. The room is quiet but humming with ritual. You dip your fingers into white paste, a mix of vinegar, lead carbonate, and wishful thinking, and begin smoothing it onto your cheeks. It stings a little, and that's normal. This was beauty in medieval Europe, where the highest compliment someone could pay you wasn't that you were glowing, but that you looked like you might faint at any moment. Pale skin wasn't just lovely, it was sacred. A signal that you were rich enough to avoid the sun, soft enough to never toil, and morally pure to your bone-white core. And so the women of the time bleached, powdered, and starved themselves toward that ideal, not because it felt good, because it meant something. Smooth skin. That wasn't just attractive. It meant your soul was unblemished, your spirit refined. A tanner freckle or a mole suspicious, possibly sinful. Some even whispered that a single mark on the face could be a sign of the devil's presence, especially if it couldn't be scrubbed away. So the game began, and it was deadly serious. Lead-based whitening creams known as ceruse were so prized that women ignored the fact they were slowly poisoning themselves with every application. As the paste cracked, burned, and eventually blistered the skin, the solution was simple: more paste. Hide the damage with thicker layers. If the cream burned holes into your cheeks, add rose water. If that made things worse, well, pray harder. Eventually your skin forgot what it was like to breathe. Mercury crept in next, promised to banish spots, brighten complexions, and melt away time itself. Also melted nerves and organs. But that didn't stop its use. If anything, the pain gave the product an air of mystique. After all, didn't saints suffer? Wasn't beauty meant to be earned through agony? Historians still argue whether this obsession with sickly perfection was a form of patriarchal control or a quiet, cruel method women used to shape their own mythologies in a world that offered them no space for power. But either way, the result was the same: a generation of ghost-faced girls praying to be admired for how close they hovered to death. And don't think it ended there. After the paste came the rouge cinnabar if you were rich red clay, or crushed beetle shells if you weren't. Applied just so to the apples of the cheeks and lips to simulate the faintest suggestion of life. Not too much, just enough to imply that blood might still flow beneath the surface, that you weren't fully gone. Yet, a woman who looked flushed was seen as vulgar. A woman who looked like she was barely here, divine. Even hair was pale. Blonde was ideal light, soft, untamed. Women soaked their locks in lye lemon juice, or in some cases goat urine. Then they'd sit in the sun for hours, veils pulled back, squinting toward heaven. waiting for the right shade of otherworldly to appear. You might imagine a court full of pale women gliding around like ghosts, and you wouldn't be wrong. But remember, for every delicate smile seen at the feast, there were hours of pain behind the curtain. A young noblewoman might wake before dawn, scrub her face raw with vinegar and rough linen, apply the paste, wait for it to dry, add rouge, dust with flour or chalk to set it, bleach the hairline, style the veil, lace the bodice. Pray she didn't sweat too much or cry or laugh lest the whole mask crack and fall. And the worst part, the moment she wiped it all away at night, her true face, blotchy, red, tired, seemed even worse by comparison. So she'd start again the next morning. That was the cycle, a haunting repetition. Paint the face, hide the damage, smile just so, speak softly, walk with grace, and never ever let them see what you really looked like. Because beauty wasn't just vanity. It was your reputation, your currency, your armor in a world that didn't offer much else. And if it killed you, well, at least you looked good at your funeral. The first time your scalp burns, you tell yourself it's a blessing. After all, beauty is sacrifice. You sit by the open window, a faint breeze filtering through linen curtains, stiff with rose water and vinegar. The maid tilts your head, gently pours the mixture over your crown. It runs down your temples, seeps into your veil, and stings your eyes. You blink but do not complain. This is the price of radiance. You've mixed it yourself this morning. Stale urine, lie a dash of alum for thickening. The stench is eye-watering. But you press on because you want that color, not honey or copper or chestnut, but blonde. Ethereal, angelic, spun sunbeam blonde. The kind that makes poets compare you to saints and saints compare you to heaven. It's not that you weren't beautiful before, you might have been. But in this world, beautiful is never enough. You must be ideal. And the ideal is pale, light-haired, and mostly silent. And so, like hundreds of women before you, you bleach. Then you wait. On rooftops, in gardens, under straw hats with holes cut out for the sun. You bake your hair in the open air, praying that the golden glow of heaven will settle into each strand like dew. You ignore the flies, you ignore the dizziness, you ignore the fact that your scalp is peeling, because when your hair finally lightens just a bit, it shimmers under candlelight, and someone notices. And for a brief flickering moment, you feel like the sacrifice was worth it. Maybe, if the beauty rituals of the face were about wiping away earthly flaws, then the rituals of the hair were about reaching towards something celestial. Blonde in the medieval imagination was not just a color, it was a symbol of virginity, of divinity, of grace. Angels were painted blonde, even when no one in that region had ever seen such hair. Saints glowed with it. Holy women shimmered in manuscripts with golden halos, not just above their heads but flowing from their crowns. So naturally, the living tried to match the myth. Of course, not all blonde came from birth. Most didn't. But nature was no excuse. If you were born a brunette, or heaven help you a redhead, the effort began early. You could try boiling saffron and lemon juice, mixing it with goat's urine and ash, and applying the mess overnight. If you were noble, you might send for imported powders from Italy or Spain. If you were desperate, you used candle wax to streak your hair, then scraped it out at dawn, hoping it pulled the color with it. Did it work? Sometimes. More often it left hair brittle dry and smelling like regret. One unfortunate recipe involved pigeon droppings mixed with honey and vinegar. Another used wine boiled with rosemary and chalk, meant to tone the brassiness. But mostly these were acts of devotion, not results. Historians still argue whether women believed these concoctions would truly transform them, or whether the ritual itself was a kind of penance, a way to participate in the great shared illusion of perfection. Like whispering a prayer even when you know the miracle won't come. What we do know is this: the ideal wasn't just blonde, it was golden. Light that came from within. And anything less was a failure not just of beauty but of virtue. Blonde was youth. It was innocence. It was worth. And for many it was the only ticket to power. Take Lucrezia Borgia. While technically a Renaissance figure, she carried the ghost of medieval ideals. Her golden hair was so prized that strands were clipped and sent as diplomatic gifts. Her locks became icons of seduction and sanctity, at once tokens passed between popes, kings, and suitors. Whether the color was natural or bleached is irrelevant. What mattered was the legend. Golden hair, golden soul. Of course, this standard excluded entire populations. Women from Southern Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, all naturally dark-haired, were often depicted in literature as dangerous, sensual, even wicked. The dark-haired woman tempted, the blonde woman saved. And so the metaphor bled into reality. In courts from Paris to Prague, women chased a look that was never meant to be attainable. They scorched their hair, stained their fingertips, and inhaled fumes that lingered in the lungs for days. They plucked hairlines high into the forehead, shaved their brows, and wore veils that glowed faintly gold, not just to impress, but to belong. Because in a world that prized appearance over essence, looking the part meant everything. And yet, they still laughed. Behind the screens, out in the herb gardens, during moments when no one watched, they giggled. They shared recipes. They whispered which mixtures worked and which ones burned too deep. Some boasted of homemade solutions. Others bribed traveling apothecaries for rare elixirs. A few simply gave up, tucked their dark hair under golden-tinted veils, and claimed to be blonde underneath. It was a shared game, and the stakes were high. Because for all its shimmer and song, medieval beauty was a brutal economy. It cost money, time, pain, and sometimes even your life. There's a documented case from 14th century England, a noblewoman who attempted a particularly potent bleach blend, hoping to match the hair color of a lady she saw in a painting. The mixture splashed in her eyes. She went blind. Her servants said she never stopped trying, not long after her portrait was commissioned. Blonde, of course. You sit now still by the window. The mixture on your hair is crusting, drying into yellowing flakes. Your scalp is blistering. A maid hands you a perfumed handkerchief. You press it to your temple and resist the urge to scratch. You don't speak, you barely move, but the candlelight catches your hair just so. It glints, glows. A page boy pauses in the corridor. Another lady glances your way. You smile softly, though your skin feels like parchment. And deep inside, a small voice says, maybe this time it worked. But you won't know until court tomorrow. And even then you'll wonder. Because in the end, beauty here is not about being admired. It's about being safe. You'd think that once you've endured the pace, the stench of the burn, you'd be safe. That perhaps the golden shimmer of your hair and the powdered smoothness of your skin would earn you a pause, a moment to breathe. But this world doesn't rest, and neither can you. Because beauty isn't a goal, it's a balancing act. One false step and the very things you work so hard to achieve can be used against you. Tonight the hall is full. Torches flicker, casting golden light against limestone walls. Musicians play softly near the hearth. You sit at the edge of the gathering hands, folded in your lap, eyes lowered just enough to be modest, but not so much as to seem evasive. Your hair glows in the torchlight. Your cheeks bloom with careful color. You're a vision, but not too much of one. Because the line between admired and condemned is thinner than a veil and twice as dangerous. You must be beautiful, yes, but not seductive. You must be pure, but not naive. Seen, but not heard. Delicate, but not weak. A contradiction tied in ribbons and layered in linen. And if you get it wrong, if your beauty suggests awareness, intent, or freedom, you become a threat. Speaking of which, The stakes for falling short of this ideal weren't just social. They were physical. A woman suspected of impurity could be shamed, disinherited, exiled, even killed. And it didn't take much. A rumor, a jealous suitor, a walk in the garden with a glance too long, a stain on a bedsheet, a poem that said too much. Historians still argue whether these purity standards truly shaped every corner of medieval life, or whether they were largely projections from male authors, clergy, and court poets. But for the girls growing up in noble households, the pressure was real, and it was constant. Your virginity was more than your own. It was your father's honor, your mother's social currency, your family's alliance strategy. One whisper about your reputation and a marriage deal could collapse. A feud could begin. A life could unravel. So yes, you learned the script early. You knew how to walk slowly, not too confidently, how to smile just enough, how to keep your eyes cast downward and your hands still, how to remain pale silent and contained, an icon of virtue painted onto the moving canvas of your life. But not every woman played the same way. Some used their reputations as tools. They feigned ignorance. They dangled their purity like bait. Some even faked virginity, using herbs to tighten powders to conceal, or simply clever storytelling. Others chose a different route entirely. They became brides of Christ, joining convents not out of deep faith, but as a way to avoid the whole marriage mess. Quirky historical tidbit: in some regions, midwives were trained to restore virginity through minor surgeries or alchemical treatments, basically the medieval version of a hymenoplasty. It wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of either, because reputation was everything, and people would go to extraordinary lengths to protect it. And yet, despite all the weight, all the pressure, women still laughed. They gossiped, they whispered, they flirted, they even loved. Secretly, softly, carefully, they wrote poetry too, traded secrets, left notes in shoes. They played the game even when they hated it. Behind the veils, under the layers, they lived, but always with one eye over their shoulder. Because being seen as impure wasn't just a gossip risk. It could destroy your future. It could take away your name. So you learned to exist in the narrowest of spaces. You sat in gardens under the gaze of a chaperone. You pretended not to notice the page boy watching you. You listened to the giggle behind the hedge and didn't flinch, not because you weren't tempted, but because you knew. You knew how quickly that kind of story could spread. And in this world, a single story could become your legacy. Your entire identity collapsed into a whisper. So you mastered the trifecta: pale, quiet, and virginal. But even then, you weren't done, because beauty didn't stop at the surface. It drilled deeper into the very symbolism of your being. And that brings us back to your hair. Golden hair, they said, wasn't just lovely, it was a halo, a visible sign of moral clarity, of divinely approved femininity, of a woman you could trust with your household, your lineage, your sons. Artists painted their Madonnas blonde, angels too, even when depicting saints from regions where no one had ever been blonde, because in the medieval imagination, blonde meant holy, and so the expectation grew. Never mind your natural shade, you were supposed to glow, and if you didn't, you had to fake it, even if it meant burns, blisters, hair loss, or worse. Even if it meant sitting in the sun for hours, scalp coated in ammonia, and lemon praying that the light would forgive your darkness. Even if it meant smelling like vinegar and goat. Because that was the trade. That was the rule. Invisibility in plain sight, so long as you were luminous. It's tempting to believe that these were just the rules of elite courts, that peasant girls in fields or merchants' daughters in cities were immune. But the truth is blurrier. Scholars still debate how far these ideals trickled down the social ladder. Some say beauty pressure was confined to aristocracy. Others point to urban centers like Florence or Venice, where even middle-class women began mimicking courtly styles, hoping for upward mobility, where a dash of powder, a lighter lock of hair, or the scent of imported rosewater could open doors. Beauty as access, beauty as safety, beauty as survival. So here you sit, your face pale, your hands still, your lips stained just enough. The candles flicker, someone enters the room. You smile faintly, carefully, like you were taught. And you pray they don't see the girl underneath. Not yet. The scent hits you before the fabric does a soft, dizzying swirl of lavender clove and crushed rose petals. It's not overpowering, not quite, but it's constant, embedded in every veil, every sleeve, every fold of linen you wear. This isn't just elegance, it's armor. Because while the medieval world may have worshipped the look of beauty, it was far less kind to the smell of it, especially for women. Tonight, as you brush a sachet of dried herbs across the inside of your neckline, you remember the rule: you must appear fresh. But you must never be seen cleaning, because bathing, oddly enough, is a bit suspicious. That's right. In a world where sweat is inevitable, where fires are smoky, where clothes are heavy, and winters are long, cleanliness itself is a balancing act between virtue and vice. Historians still argue whether people in the Middle Ages truly avoided bathing, or whether that's just a myth amplified by later centuries. Some evidence suggests people did wash frequently even, but public bathhouses, especially for women, were increasingly discouraged, seen as portals to temptation and sin. In short, if you tried too hard to be clean, people got ideas. So what's a woman to do? You don't sweat less than the men around you. You just have to hide it better. Enter medieval scent culture. For noble women, hygiene became a matter of illusion. You bathe sparingly, carefully, modestly. A basin and a cloth, perhaps warm water infused with herbs. You scrub the parts that matter and pray no one gets close enough to question the rest. To smell right, not too floral, not too strong, just faintly divine, you rely on oils. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, violet. You dab them behind your ears, onto your sleeves, under your wimple. If you're wealthy, you might even own a pomander, a small decorative sphere filled with aromatic resin. You wear it around your neck or tuck it inside your bodice. It swings softly with each step like a secret breeze. There's also the perfumed glove, a luxury accessory soaked in scented oil, sometimes so potent it made courtiers swoon either from the smell or the cost. And perhaps most quirkily, your undergarments are stuffed with herbs. Mint for freshness, marjoram for calm, a little sage if you're superstitious. It's like walking around with a medieval potpourri sachet between layers of linen. Does it work? Sometimes. Other times, it just mixes with everything else: smoke, sweat, animal hair, and that persistent tang of iron from the fire pokers, and creates what can only be described as church-scented barnyard. But you try, because you must. Because the ideal woman doesn't just look like a vision, she smells like a miracle. Ballads speak of heroines who carried the scent of spring rain, honeycomb, or lilies in bloom, and you're supposed to match that, naturally. Spoiler alert, nothing about this is natural. Let's not forget your hair. You have already lightened it to match the glow of angels. Now it's time to keep it from turning into a bird's nest. Modern scalp care may pride itself on rosemary oil or scalp scrubs, but medieval women, they were already there, rubbing. Rosemary boiled in wine into their heads, not just to clean, but to cheer the brain, according to one manual. Not that you're cheering much as the lice comb goes through, or as your maid tries delicately to unbraid a week's worth of hidden tangles and unwelcome guests. Lice, fleas, mites. They didn't care how divine you smelled, which is why in truth many women wore their hair covered not just for modesty, but for protection. And here's another contradiction. While the world expected your golden locks to shimmer like a saint's, it also demanded they remain mostly hidden in public. You might give a glimpse, a wisp at the temple, a coil along your collar, but to fully reveal it, that would be immodest, or worse, tempting. So your hair becomes a private glory, a whispered promise, something a suitor might dream of but never quite see. Still, you tend to it obsessively. Some women used egg whites to stiffen curls. Others made scalp pastes from burnt almonds and vinegar. A few claimed rubbing powdered amber into the part line kept spirits away. Who's to say it didn't? Historians still debate how much of this was daily practice versus special occasion prep. Did women really oil themselves head to toe every week? Or were these rituals reserved for festivals and feasts? Either way, the expectation lingered to be fragrant but never perfumed. Be ethereal but never artificial. Be spotless but don't scrub. There's one particular woman the troubadours loved to reference, Isolde of Brittany, not the more famous Isolde from the Tristan legend, but her lesser-known literary foil. She was described as golden-haired, soft-voiced, and this is key smelling like flowers even after riding for days. Now, whether that was just poetic metaphor or the result of an extreme perfume habit, no one knows, but it set a precedent. Even after a journey, you must smell like May. No pressure. Let's say, despite all this, the lavender oil didn't do the trick today. Your scalp is itchy, your sleeves are damp, and the hall is crowded. Still, a knight passes by, pauses, leans close, and says softly, "You smell like the first day of spring." You smile faintly, the practiced tilt of your head catching just enough candlelight to highlight your cheek. You're sweating under your layers. You haven't bathed in days. But no one has to know, because you've won for now. Tomorrow you'll do it all again. The comb, the oils, the sachets, the scalp rubs, the whispered worry that something smells off. Because in this world, being beautiful isn't enough. You must be undeniably pleasant in every way, even to the nose. Your scalp still tingles from yesterday's sun session, lemon saffron goat's urine, and a wide-brimmed straw hat with a circle cut out to let the light reach your strands. It was all in the name of that impossible shade, the spun gold halo of elite medieval womanhood. But now seated before your carved oak mirror, it's time for the next ritual. The one that really separates myth from mortality. Skin. Specifically, how to make yours look like it's never belonged to a living creature. Not flushed, not blemished, not textured. Ideally, your complexion should resemble the untouched wax of a saint's statue or the underbelly of a lily, smooth, pale, and eerily luminous. And if your face shows signs of sun stress or even, heaven forbid, human vitality, there's a solution. Several, in fact, none of them safe. You reach for your cosmetics box. It's a small wooden chest lined with velvet, its contents deadly and divine in equal measure. This is where your true transformation begins. Let's start with the centerpiece, ceruse. It sounds delicate, doesn't it? Like the name of a flower. But ceruse is anything but gentle. A thick white paint made from vinegar and white lead aged in clay pots until it turns silky and smooth. A noblewoman's favorite and her slowest poison. You apply it in gentle pats, avoiding your eyes. You know what it's made of. Everyone does. But it's worth it. The way it masks your exhaustion, smooths your pores, and lifts your status with every powdery swipe. Your goal is simple look, like someone who has never labored, never flushed from effort, never felt hunger or heartbreak. In a world full of pain, your face must float above it. One documented case from England describes a lady who wore ceruse daily for years. She maintained a famously ghostly beauty until her skin began peeling off in strips, but that came later. For now, you just glow. Next comes the rouge red ochre or crushed beetles mixed with fat dabbed lightly on the cheeks. Not too much. Too much red suggests lust. Too little and you look sickly. Then the coal for your eyes, ground antimony, or burnt almonds smeared onto a tiny brush of straw. You drag it gently along your lids, crafting shadows that whisper mystery without screaming seduction. Your lips, a subtle tint, madder root or wine sediment, and if you have freckles, well, freckles are considered imperfections, stains from the sun, moral blotches as some churchmen call them, so you cover them with more ceruse, then top it all with a dusting of rice powder. If you're lucky, it holds through dinner. If not, you'll reapply in secret. Historians still argue about how widespread this level of cosmetic use truly was. Was it confined to elite circles in Paris, Florence, and London? Or did it reach middle-class women with dreams of courtly life? Either way, the manuals survived. The recipes, the warnings, and the expectations. One quirky beauty tip from the 14th century suggests bathing your face in rabbit's blood before applying makeup to soften the soul's outer veil. Another recommends placing raw veal under your chin overnight to reduce sagging. Desperate times, desperate measures. Of course, men noticed. Troubadours and poets described ladies whose skin outshone the moon or was as pale as sorrow. And like the golden hair craze, these verses shaped reality. Women tried to match the metaphor, even if it meant poisoning themselves slowly. There's a word for that kind of commitment. It's not love. It's survival. Because if your face didn't meet the moment, if your skin cracked, if your blush faded, if your lips dried, you risked more than embarrassment. You risked disbelief. And in a culture where everything about a woman's worth hinged on appearance, disbelief was dangerous. You were either a maiden or a mystery, but never a mess. Even illness didn't excuse you. If you looked sick, you were pitied. But if you looked tired, unkempt, blotchy, red-eyed, that was your fault. One noblewoman, upon falling ill with a fever, demanded her maid rouge her cheeks and powder her temples before the bishop arrived to pray over her. She died looking flawless. Because that's what mattered. Your appearance was your afterlife preview. Let's not forget the social stench of appearing unkempt. A blotchy face could spark rumors. Was she drinking morning pregnant in this world where women's bodies were endlessly scrutinized? Every patch of redness became a question, every shadow a story. You weren't just painting beauty, you were painting silence, obedience, grace, and perhaps most importantly, control. Control over the uncontrollable. You can't stop your suitor from losing interest, or your husband from chasing a maid, but you can make yourself glow like the Virgin in the chapel window. You can fake what the world demands, even if it kills you. Now mirror work done, you slip into your gown, layered velvet, tight sleeves embroidery that took a widow's eyesight and a year of her life. You apply a final touch, pearls crushed and mixed with vinegar dabbed onto the bridge of your nose and chin for added shimmer. The effect is stunning, otherworldly. You look like someone who doesn't need to eat, or sleep, or breathe. You look like a painting. And that's the goal. Because in this era, beauty isn't about being alive. It's about looking like you're slowly fading out of existence. You are not supposed to sweat. That's the unspoken rule, impossible, absurd, but stubbornly enforced in whispers, glances, and poetry that never quite acknowledges the weight of velvet or the heat of summer. And yet here you are, layered in brocade and wool sleeves, tight around your arms, a veil clinging to your damp forehead, sitting through court, with a stillness so perfect it might as well be painted. Because stillness is its own kind of performance. Even as your back aches, even as your scalp stings from yesterday's bleach and urine session, you must remain poised. Because beauty in the medieval world was not about health or vitality, it was about fragility. The more delicate you appeared, the higher your value. Not because anyone wanted you weak exactly, but because weakness was mistaken for virtue. Pale skin meant you didn't toil. A faint voice meant modesty. A thin frame meant self-restraint. and a woman who looked close to fainting. A woman who shimmered just slightly from the strain of it all. She was irresistible. Historians still argue whether these ideals were widely internalized or just artistic conventions drawn from male poets and clerics rather than real women's lives. But evidence suggests that at least among the noble class, the illusion of fading was prized above all. Let's talk about the waist. Slimness was expected. Not toned, not athletic, just narrow, ethereal, like the body had simply forgotten how to hold flesh. Corsetry, as we think of it now, didn't exist in quite the same way in medieval Europe, but belts, girdles, and tight underlayers absolutely did. Some women even tied cords beneath their gowns to compress the waist subtly. Others padded their hips to make the center appear smaller by contrast. One beauty manual from 14th century Florence advises women to sleep with a smooth wooden board pressed against the stomach to remind the body of its shape. Another recommends drinking vinegar before meals to suppress appetite and sweeten breath. And while food scarcity did much of the work, control over food, especially in public, became a symbol of grace. You nibble, you smile, you excuse yourself before dessert. Because hunger in the right context looks holy. There's even a quasi-religious fervor to the way beauty and suffering become entwined. Women who fasted were praised for their willpower. Those who visibly wilted from the effort dark circles limbs were sometimes compared to saints. A fringe historical figure named Lutgardis of Evieres claimed visions after fasting for weeks and eating only crushed violets and barley water. Whether she truly believed or simply learned how to turn fragility into power is a question scholars still explore. The point is, looking breakable gave you leverage. A man might fight for a fierce woman, but he'd kneel for one who looked like a sigh, wrapped in silk. It wasn't just the body, though. Movement mattered. You walked slowly, gracefully. You lowered your gaze, you folded your hands. If your laugh rang too loud, if your step sounded too firm, you risked attention of the wrong kind. Beauty meant not drawing attention, but also never being overlooked. It was a paradox, a trap. Let's step back for a moment and consider what this all required. To look like you were made of porcelain, you had to endure things no porcelain could survive. Burns from bleach, open sores from lead, digestive issues from vinegar, scalp infections from lice and chemicals, sleepless nights, restricted breathing, endless control. And if you slipped, if your skin flared up from a bad batch of ceruse, or your hair broke off from too much sunlight, or your stomach gave out from another vinegar, fast well, you just weren't trying hard enough. One noblewoman from Burgundy reportedly collapsed at a feast from heat stroke, her rouge streaked with sweat. She was carried out, and guests whispered that her constitution was unsound. Never mind the layers of wool, the blazing torches, the week of preparation, the fasting, the prayers. She had failed the test of graceful suffering, so the lesson was clear: don't collapse. Not in public, not in private, not even in your own mind. Every part of you had to cooperate in the illusion. Even your voice. A soft voice was expected. A high pitch, gentle melodic, just enough breathiness to suggest your lungs were too fragile for full sentences. In love poems, women didn't argue. They didn't shout. They murmured. They sighed. They spoke in riddles or sang under their breath. A loud woman was dangerous. A laughing woman, questionable. And so you trained yourself to modulate. One vocal instruction manual from a 15th century abbey even advised noblewomen to practice reading aloud, as if speaking to a dove perched on your palm, not to impress anyone, but to become someone worth impressing. It all loops back to the same cruel truth. To appear beautiful, you had to appear as though life itself barely touched you. And yet it touched you constantly, through hunger, through heat, through fear, through judgment, through isolation, through the quiet knowledge that no matter how flawless you looked today, you'd have to do it all again tomorrow. Let's not forget this wasn't a world that rewarded age, or wisdom, or endurance. It rewarded the appearance of fragility, not the cost of maintaining it, which makes what came next all the more ironic. You were expected not just to shimmer through dinner, but also to bear children, to endure childbirth, to survive infections, cold winters, household management, political maneuvering, and more. But you had to look like a snowdrop in the shade while doing it. So here you sit, chin lifted back, straight the scent of rosemary clinging to your sleeves, stomach pinched from too tight laces. A courtier passes by, nods, and in that moment you believe it's working. You look the part. You've survived the day, you've suffered beautifully, and no one sees the cost. It's twilight now. A hush falls over the stone corridors of your household. Candles flicker, fabric rustles. Somewhere downstairs a lute sighs its final chord of the evening, and you, still stiff in your posture and delicate in your scent, finally retreat to your chamber. Here, in the privacy of four walls and fluttering tapestries, the performance should end. But it doesn't, because medieval beauty didn't stop when the sun set. In fact, some of its most punishing rituals were saved for these quiet hours when the eyes of court have turned away but the mirror still watches. You begin with your evening cleanse. A basin of tepid water, a cloth soaked in vinegar and rose water meant to strip away the day's layers of powder sweat and silent anxiety. You dab gently, wincing when the vinegar meets a raw spot along your cheekbone. Cyrus did that, but you don't flinch, because flinching is for the weak, for the untrained. You follow with the goose fat and chalk blended into a thick salve. It soothes the skin while simultaneously whitening it further. You coat your face, your neck, the tops of your hands, anywhere the candlelight might catch in the morning. Then comes the plucking. Eyebrows arched to look eternally surprised. Hairlines shaved to create the illusion of a taller, more virtuous forehead. You sit before your bronze mirror and carefully tug at the soft hairs that don't fit the ideal. A higher brow meant higher virtue, or so the poet said. Historians still argue whether the shaved forehead fashion was widespread across all classes, or just a peculiar courtly trend among the elite. Either way, it's stuck in portraits. Women with 5 heads solemn and celestial. And if you didn't naturally have that angelic dome, you created it. One hair at a time. One quirky remedy often whispered among chambermaids involved rubbing walnut oil on the forehead to inhibit hair regrowth. Another involved crushed ivy and egg whites. Did it work? Probably not. But the belief was enough to justify the sting. As you move through your nightly preparations, you think about tomorrow's gathering at court. A new poet is expected, one who favors metaphors of lilies and glass. Already the ladies whisper about pale gloves and translucent veils. You make a mental note to steep your linen wrap in lavender overnight, because tomorrow's beauty begins tonight. And then the mask, not the kind worn for disguise or drama, but a night mask smeared thick with honey vinegar and ground pearls. It hardens as you sleep, stiffening your face into a frozen expression of serenity. To your left, on a small stool, sits your cosmetic book. A handwritten collection of recipes pass from mother to daughter, servant to mistress, sometimes hidden behind false covers for modesty. It includes concoctions for tooth whiteners, charcoal and mint skin bleaches lid and vinegar, lip stains, dried rose petals and wine, and more alarmingly poultices to stop menstruation for occasions of courtly attire. You've read them all. Some you've tried, some you've bled for. Because what is blood when reputation is at stake? Even as your head hits the straw-stuffed pillow, the work continues. You sleep in a particular position to avoid creasing the face. You wrap your hair in linen, not for comfort, but to preserve the golden shine. You breathe through parted lips, trained and quiet, and you dream not of love or fields or freedom, but of perception, of being seen and admired and untouched. Let's shift scenes briefly beyond your private chamber. Let's drift through the halls of medieval society and meet a few others who also lived under this impossible glow. Isolde of Brittany, fictional in legend but vivid in the medieval imagination, was praised not only for her skin and hair, but for smelling like flowers after travel. Whether this was metaphor or the result of obsessive perfume use, we'll never know. But the point stuck. Women were expected to carry a meadow within them even through mud and distance. Or consider Lucretia Borgia slightly post-medieval, but shaped by its legacy. Her golden hair was so revered it was sent as a diplomatic gift, strands preserved in jewelry and letters. Was it her natural shade, or the result of boiling saffron goat urine and citrus juice under the Italian sun? Again, it doesn't matter. What mattered was the myth. The symbol. One rare account tells of a noblewoman who went blind from attempting to match the hair of a painting. Bleach in the eye. The injury became legend, another cautionary tale whispered between servants. And still, the expectations endured. Even when the skin burned, even when the eyes failed, even when the smell of urine and vinegar clung to the fabric. Beauty was not about reality, it was about the myth that hovered just out of reach. So you now half asleep under your veil and mask understand your place in that myth. You will not eat enough, you will not rest well, you will not age freely, but you will shimmer. Because if you do not shimmer, you might as well not exist. Let's not forget, though, beneath this crushing burden, women rebelled in small ways. They gossiped behind fans, they snuck into the kitchens and ate figs and cheese. They slipped out to festivals and flirted with musicians. They formed friendships, shared salves, compared remedies. They laughed even when they were told not to. Beauty was brutal. But it was not always silent, and sometimes rebellion looked like a smile with teeth. Morning light spills through the lattice of your chamber window, filtered gold and cool mist. The birdsong is muffled by heavy walls, and a servant's footsteps pad softly across the flagstones. You're already awake. You've been awake for a while. Because rest is not restoration here, it's just a pause between performances. You rise not quickly, but with the measured grace of someone who knows they are being watched, even when they aren't. Every movement, even in solitude, is a rehearsal. Today you'll be seen. And so the ritual begins again. First your breath. A rinse of wine and crushed fennel swirled in your mouth, not swallowed. No toothbrush exists, at least not by modern standards, but you have a toothpick carved from bone and a handful of ash to scrub if needed. There's a myth that cloves pressed to the tongue grant sweetness. You chew one now, it stings. Next the skin, you touch your cheeks gently, still tender from last night's mask. You reach for your ceruse, the infamous white paint of vinegar, and let aged until it curdles like spoiled milk. You smooth it on thin, even though your skin protests. Your complexion now glows a dead sort of white, a shade praised in love poems as the light of untouched alabaster. Historians still debate whether women truly used lead-based cosmetics so often, or whether it's exaggerated by modern retellings. But archaeological evidence shows high lead levels in the remains of upper-class women, suggesting that yes, vanity came with a price. And then the color not too much, never too bold. Rouge made from crushed cochineal or dried beetroot applied high on the cheeks to mimic the flush of innocence. Lips tinted just enough to look like you've been kissed by a breeze, not by a person. That would be scandalous. You fasten your girdle, tying it beneath your gown in the shape of a subtle cinch. Not corseted exactly, medieval fashion didn't have steel bones or lacing, in the way later centuries did, but tight enough to shape you. Your breath shortens slightly. That's good. A fluttering chest implies delicacy. Now your hair. If you're fortunate, you were born with the golden strands praised in courts from Florence to Flanders. If not, you bleach, or you cheat, or you despair. One fringe recipe involves saffron, lemon juice, alum, and goat's urine boiled into a paste and applied beneath a hat with the crown cut out, allowing your hair to roast in sunlight. You've done this. Your scalp has the scars to prove it. And yet blonde is power. Not honey blonde, not strawberry. But halo light like you've been kissed by heaven and forgot to come back. You wrap your hair today instead, hiding its uneven tones beneath a thin veil. The veil is dyed faintly yellow, a trick of illusion, like painting shadows on a sculpture. Maybe someone will believe you're golden underneath. Maybe that's enough. You step into your shoes, thin leather, no arch support, just a whisper of protection between you and the cold stone. Your gown today is blue dyed with woad, not lapis, because true ultramarine is too expensive unless you are a saint in a manuscript or a bride on display. Your maid tightens your sleeves, pins the veil, adjusts your belt. You check the mirror once, not because you doubt, but because doubt is expected. Women are supposed to be unsure. It makes them more beautiful. Then before you leave, a final touch. You open a tiny pomander, a hollow filigreed orb filled with herbs and resins. It dangles from your waist, releasing a slow perfume of lavender clove and myrrh. It is your shield against the world's many stenches, sweat, smoke, illness, and the occasional reminder that most people do not smell like violets. This is not just for vanity, it's for survival. Because in a time where baths are rare and hot water is a threat to fertility, scent becomes political. Women were told to be fragrant but not overtly perfumed, clean but never wet, pure but not sterile. You were to smell like spring, not soap. And so you step into the hallway, lightly, powdered lightly, perfumed lightly, starving, and begin your day. Let's pan across to another chamber, another woman, another variation of the same performance. She's a widow now, older, experienced. Her beauty is remembered, whispered about like a legend, but she too prepares with care. Not for courtship, but for power. Widows in the medieval world, especially noble ones, held strange leverage. No longer under a husband's rule, no longer a maiden to be guarded. They walked a tightrope between freedom and suspicion. Some wore black, others grey. Some kept their hair covered entirely. But many continued the rituals of beauty not to attract, but to assert. There are documented cases of widows using cosmetics to maintain social capital, attending court, mediating disputes, managing estates. One Venetian noblewoman in the 14th century was famous for her ever-shining forehead and used white lead paint well into her 50s. Historians still argue whether these practices empowered older women or trapped them in youth's ghost. But in the absence of institutional power, beauty became a kind of currency. And even in convents where the veil was thick and the hours long, women still whispered of rosewater and honey. Some nuns, especially those from noble families, brought vanity mirrors with them secreted in cloisters, polished with cloth. Even in renunciation, the body lingered. Back in your own day, you arrive at court. Heads turn. You don't smile too wide, just enough. Your skin catches the candlelight. A squire stumbles on his words. Someone murmurs your name. You sip watered wine and don't eat. You are beautiful. You are tired. You are winning, but you're not sure of what. Because the standard keeps moving. Every day, every poem, every rumor, someone younger arrives, someone blonder, someone quieter, paler, thinner, sweeter. You are a candle in a hallway of mirrors, but still you burn, because that's what you were told to do. You're sitting very still, not because you want to, but because the sleeves of your gown are so tight you can't really move your arms. Also, the bench is narrow, the hall is drafty, and your bodice is laced just enough to remind you not to breathe deeply. A breeze flutters through the tapestries and tickles the back of your neck where tiny raw welts from yesterday's scalp treatment still sting faintly. Across the great hall, a troubadour is singing something mournful and sweet about lilies and death, the usual. And you sit like everyone expects, straight-backed and luminous. But in your head, you're thinking about your eyelashes. Yes, your eyelashes. Because earlier your maid told you that Lady Celeste, the Count's niece, had darkened hers using a mixture of crushed elderberries and soot. Makes them look longer, she whispered, like a holy angel. You'd tried a version of it this morning, something involving ash and a little honey, and now your lashes feel sticky and there's something buzzing suspiciously near your right eye. But you don't blink. Blinking would ruin the effect. Medieval beauty wasn't just about color and scent and shape, it was about stillness too. Poise. You were expected to move like a saint in a stained glass window, graceful, glowing, untouchable. Historians still argue whether this cult of stillness was strictly a noble obsession, or whether it filtered into merchant-class expectations as well. But across portraits and poetry, one thing is clear: movement was mundane. Stasis was sacred. And yet the body rebels. Let's talk for a moment about sweat. Because even as you sit here in your layers of linen and wool and velvet, your skin is damp. Not glistening, not glowing, just sweating. And it's not even summer yet. You shift slightly to ease the itching under your sleeves, careful not to wrinkle the fabric or disturb your carefully arranged veil. You know what happens to women who smell like effort. The pressure to stay fragrant wasn't just about seduction, it was spiritual. Writers of the era claimed that saintly women emitted holy scents after death. One even noted that the body of Sinclair did not decay, nor did it stink, but gave off the perfume of lilies. Whether this was fact or florid fiction, it mattered, because now every living woman had to compete with the corpses of saints. No pressure. So how did medieval women cope with layers? Not just of fabric, but of trickery. You wore fresh linen closest to the skin, washed as often as possible, even if your body wasn't. Then between layers, you tucked herbs, sachets of mint, thyme, rosemary. Some were stitched into your sleeves, others hung from belts. You carried pomanders like talismans. And before court, you dabbed your pulse points with rosewater or spiced vinegar. It helped, a little, unless it rained, or unless you had to dance, or unless, as in your case right now, someone lit a new fire in the hearth, and the temperature just jumped 10 degrees. You dab at your neck with a corner of your veil. Nobody sees. Probably. Meanwhile, down the bench, Lady Celeste is fanning herself with a folded piece of parchment and smiling at no one in particular. Her hair is blonde, but suspiciously brittle-looking, possibly lemon-treated, possibly regretful. You wonder if she has open sores on her scalp too. You briefly consider asking. But then you remember comparison is part of the game, but confession is not. Everyone is suffering a little. No one is saying it. It's important here to pause and remember these standards weren't just annoying, they were dangerous. Repeated exposure to lead-based makeup caused toxicity. Women experienced hair loss, facial ulcers, tremors, and even death. But beauty manuals kept circulating, suggesting that a little vinegar and lead, aged properly, would whiten the face and lighten the spirit. Fringe fact, some even recommended arsenic powder as a brightening agent, used sparingly, of course. Though what sparingly means in a culture that also thinks goat urine is acceptable skincare, we'll leave that to interpretation. And it didn't stop at faces. Some women wore belladonna drops to dilate their pupils, mimicking the doe-eyed look described in romance poetry. It made vision blurry, headaches common. But large pupils were associated with passion and virtue. Yes, somehow both. One case in 13th century France documents a woman who passed out in church because she'd overdone the belladonna. The priest blamed demonic possession. Her maid whispered later, she just wanted to look like the Virgin in the painting, art imitating life again, or vice versa. Back in the hall, the troubadour has switched to a livelier tune. Something about swans and longing. A few of the younger courtiers begin to rise, maybe a dance is forming. You hesitate. Your shoes are delicate. Your scalp is tender. You feel the veneer of fragrance beginning to slip. But you stand anyway. Because if you don't participate, someone will notice. And in medieval society, being noticed for the wrong thing was worse than being invisible. You take your place in the ring, you move carefully, you let your skirts glide, your hands float, your eyes flicker politely, but not too much. You smile just enough, not more. And for a moment, just a moment, you almost forget the pressure. Almost. The music carries you. The torches flicker. Someone whispers something kind in your direction. And your heart, despite everything, lifts. Because buried beneath the vinegar and rouge and ceremonial discomfort, you're still human. And humans like to feel beautiful. Even if the cost is ridiculous, even if it's brutal, even if it's impossible, the torches have burned lower now. The music faded 2 dances ago, and you've made your excuses something vague about a faintness in the head and returned to your chamber. A maid trails behind, unlacing your gown with careful fingers. She doesn't ask questions. She doesn't need to. You sit by the hearth, skin flushed and head aching slightly, and think, how much longer can I keep this up? The truth is, beauty in the medieval world was a full-time occupation. It wasn't a preference. It wasn't self-expression. It was survival, especially for women of your class. And as the fire cracks softly in the dark, your mind wanders back through the layers of unspoken rules that brought you here. You were born a girl, which meant you were born to be looked at. But not too much. You were to be admired, not stared at, desired, not touched, married off, not pursued. And every day that razor-thin line between beautiful and improper felt like a tightrope. You were forced to walk in slippers made of eggshell. Historians still argue whether women believed in these ideals or simply performed them, whether they internalized the expectations or just survived within them. But either way, the outcome was the same vigilance. Constant, exhausting vigilance. Your veil slips slightly and your maid gently adjusts it, not speaking. You wonder how many times she's done the same for other women, each of them trying to meet a standard so sharp it cuts them even as they chase it. And for what? Let's talk about marriage. Because that was the supposed endpoint of all this effort. Not joy, not fulfillment, just marriage. A union negotiated by fathers and uncles, sealed with land or livestock, and carried out with all the romance of a business merger. Your beauty was your dowry's best friend, enhancing your prospects if you were lucky, salvaging them if you weren't. One story, half whispered through generations, tells of a noble family who kept their plainest daughter indoors for 2 years, bleaching her skin and hair with increasingly extreme methods before presenting her at court. The goal: marry her off to a minor lord with no heirs. The result: a successful engagement and a lifetime of migraines, skin lesions, and scalp infections. But she was married, which meant she had succeeded, even if her face barely moved anymore from the damage. The line between beauty and ruin was thinner than the linen camise pressed against your collarbones. And heaven help you if you fell on the wrong side. Now in your chamber, your maid has left. You sit alone. The candles flicker. You remove your veil. Beneath it, your hair smells faintly of lemons, rosemary, and old regret. You begin the slow work of unpinning it gingerly, carefully, because the scabs from last week's sun bleach haven't fully healed. You wince, and then you catch sight of yourself in the mirror. The surface is wavy, slightly warped. No clean reflection here, just hints of a woman in fragments. Pale cheeks, downcast eyes, a mouth painted faintly rose. You look like every poem ever written about a noble maiden. You don't recognize yourself. This, too, was part of the standard to become the ideal you had to erase. What made you you? Your freckles, your laugh, the way your hair frizzed in damp weather, the sound of your voice when you weren't whispering. You remember once, years ago, laughing loudly in the orchard. Your tutor scolded you, "Ladies, do not bellow. You've barely raised your voice since." They never told you that beauty was a performance, but they showed you every day. and the rules change constantly. Let's not forget the eyebrow situation. Yes, that was a thing. In many courts, particularly in the 14th and 15th centuries, plucked eyebrows and even plucked hairlines were considered fashionable. A high smooth forehead was a mark of elegance, perhaps suggesting intelligence or serenity. So women plucked and plucked, and sometimes used pumice stones or vinegar-based solutions to remove hair from the temples and forehead, reshaping their face into an unnatural mask of refinement. One beauty manual advised pluck your brows until the arch may house the moon and smooth your brow until it speaks of silence. Whatever that means. You tried it once, it hurt, but the compliments afterward were soft, approving just enough to convince you it was worth it. Another quirky trend. The tooth blackening trick. While in most of Europe, white or pearly teeth were prized in certain times and places, especially Japan. Centuries later, women darkened their teeth with soot and iron filings for ritual or symbolic purposes. Europe didn't go quite that far, but women still manipulated their smiles, scrubbing with ashes, chewing herbs, avoiding certain foods, because even your teeth were supposed to perform. Nothing escaped the gaze, and that gaze never blinked. Back in your chamber, you finish unwinding your hair. You smooth it gently with oil. You hum softly to yourself even though no one's around. It's not a tune, just a comfort. Tomorrow you'll wake again and begin the ritual. You'll pluck and powder and perfume. You'll walk slowly. Speak gently. Smile just enough. Because the world has told you that your value lies in how well you disappear into expectation. But tonight, just for now, you sit by the fire, hair unbound skin, bear the scent of lavender and old ash clinging to the air. And for a moment, you feel real. Morning breaks through the lattice window, not with a burst of golden sunlight, but with a soft grey seep dawn. In a medieval city is more smoke than sparkle. You stretch carefully in your narrow bed, feeling the stiffness settle into your shoulders before your feet even touch the floor. There's no such thing as a lazy morning in your world, not for a woman, especially not for a woman who must spend 2 hours preparing to be seen. Your maid enters quietly, arms full of linen and little jars. She's already warmed the rosemary oil by the hearth, and today's hair scent will be lavender, not because you chose it, but because the rose water ran out last week and shipments are delayed. As she begins brushing your hair, you wince, not just from the tangles, but from the tenderness of yesterday's vanity. Some patches along your scalp are scabbing again. You say nothing. It's not worth mentioning, not when so many other girls would endure worse for a single glance of approval. You remember your cousin Melisande. She tried a lemon honey ash paste she learned about in a beauty manual, claimed it was from Florence. The result, chemical burns along both temples. But when she returned to court, people said she looked luminous. And so she did it again. Historians still debate whether such treatments were widespread or limited to the beauty-obsessed elite. But the recipes remain, in manuscripts, in margins, in whispers passed from maid to maid, chamber to chamber. And today, your chamber will play host to yet another ritual, cosmetics. Let's talk about Suze. No, not a charming French nickname. Suze is a thick, deadly concoction made from white lead and vinegar aged in clay pots until it achieves the consistency of cold butter. Women applied it to their faces to create a porcelain sheen pale and expressionless, like the Blessed Virgin carved in alabaster. You don't use Suze every day, only on feast days, or when someone important is visiting, or when you need to outshine someone who's been whispering about you behind fans and folded parchment. So quite often, really. Today it's a subtle version, just enough to blur the stress lines near your mouth. Just enough to even your tone. Just enough to remind everyone at court that you are flawless, even if your skin is screaming beneath the mask. As your maid daubs your cheeks, you catch a glimpse of yourself in the small mirror, your eyes rimmed in ash, your cheeks pinched for color, your lips touched with a thin layer of mulberry juice and powdered cinnamon. You look like a poem. You feel like a lie. And yet you know the power this look holds. You remember that one time in the Winter Hall when Lord Bertrand stared a moment too long. When Lady Helene narrowed her eyes and said your complexion glowed. When your father nodded in quiet approval, as if your painted face had secured an alliance he hadn't yet negotiated. Your beauty, artificial as it was, moved the world around you. That made it feel almost real, but the side effects were harder to ignore. Let's count a few. Dryness, cracking and flaking of the skin, swollen eyelids from crushed violet paste, itching always, the itching from powdery residue settling into pores, and of course the occasional blackened teeth from lead absorption, very fashionable. One fringe case recorded in a noblewoman's correspondence mentioned her skin peeling in long translucent strips like the bark of a birch tree she wrote eerily poetic in her resignation. And yet she added, "Still they call me angelic." This wasn't vanity. Not really. This was currency. And as you step into your outer gown and lift your chin for the final pin at your throat, you remind yourself you don't get to choose the game. Only how well you play it. In some places the rules are even harsher. Let's travel briefly to Italy 15th century, where city-states like Florence and Venice have developed a full-blown aesthetic economy. Their beauty isn't just a feminine duty, it's a civic virtue. You're expected to look pleasing because you represent your family, your husband, your father's trade. One scholar notes that merchants would sometimes invest in their daughters' beauty regimens as part of a larger strategy to improve their social standing. Cosmetic supplies were part of the dowry. In Venice, beauty manuals were copied and distributed in elite circles, complete with diagrams and strange concoctions involving crushed pearls, snail slime, or powdered coral. And every now and then something new made the rounds: a French method, a Moorish tincture, a Greek balm said to erase years from the face. All untested, all potentially poisonous, all irresistible. Back in your chamber, the preparation is complete. Your maid smooths your veil, you rise, you thank her softly, and then you walk toward the door, not because you want to be seen, but because you must be. There is a luncheon today. Someone important will be there. You take a deep breath. The Suze tingles slightly as it dries. You smile not too broadly, and you step into the hall radiant and hollow in equal measure. Morning breaks through the lattice window, not with a burst of golden sunlight, but with a soft grey seep. Dawn in the medieval city is more smoke than sparkle. You stretch carefully in your narrow bed, feeling the stiffness settle into your shoulders before your feet even touch the floor. There's no such thing as a lazy morning in your world. Not for a woman. Especially not for a woman who must spend 2 hours preparing to be seen. Your maid enters quietly, arms full of linen and little jars. She's already warmed the rosemary oil by the hearth, and today's hair scent will be lavender, not because you chose it, but because the rose water ran out last week and shipments are delayed. As she begins brushing your hair, you wince. Not just from the tangles, but from the tenderness of yesterday's vanity. Some patches along your scalp are scabbing again. You say nothing. It's not worth mentioning, not when so many other girls would endure worse for a single glance of approval. You remember your cousin Melisande. She tried a lemon honey ash paste she learned about in a beauty manual, claimed it was from Florence. The result? Chemical, burns along both temples. But when she returned to court, people said she looked luminous, and so she did it again. Historians still debate whether such treatments were widespread or limited to the beauty-obsessed elite, but the recipes remain, in manuscripts, in margins, in whispers passed from maid to maid, chamber to chamber. And today your chamber will play host to yet another ritual cosmetics. Let's talk about Suze. No, not a charming French nickname. Suze is a thick, deadly concoction made from white lead and vinegar aged in clay pots until it achieves the consistency of cold butter. Women applied it to their faces to create a porcelain sheen, pale and expressionless, like the Blessed Virgin carved in alabaster. You don't use Suze every day. only on feast days, or when someone important is visiting, or when you need to outshine someone who's been whispering about you behind fans and folded parchment. So quite often, really. Today it's a subtle version, just enough to blur the stress lines near your mouth, just enough to even your tone, just enough to remind everyone at court that you are flawless, even if your skin is screaming beneath the mask. As your maid daubs your cheeks, you catch a glimpse of yourself in the small mirror, your eyes rimmed in ash, your cheeks pinched for color, your lips touched with a thin layer of mulberry juice and powdered cinnamon. You look like a poem. You feel like a lie. And yet, you know the power this look holds. You remember that one time in the Winter Hall, when Lord Bertrand stared a moment too long. When Lady Helene narrowed her eyes and said your complexion glowed. When your father nodded in quiet approval as if your painted face had secured an alliance he hadn't yet negotiated. Your beauty, artificial as it was, moved the world around you. That made it feel almost real. But the side effects were harder to ignore. Let's count a few. Dryness, cracking and flaking of the skin, swollen eyelids from crushed violet paste, itching, always the itching from powdery residue settling into pores, and of course the occasional blackened teeth from the lead absorption, very fashionable. One fringe case recorded in a noblewoman's correspondence mentioned her skin peeling in long translucent strips, like the bark of a birch tree. She wrote eerily poetic in her resignation. And yet she added, "Still, they call me angelic." This wasn't vanity, not really. This was currency. And as you step into your outer gown and lift your chin for the final pin at your throat, you remind yourself you don't get to choose the game, only how well you play it. In some places, the rules are even harsher. Let's travel briefly to Italy, 15th century, where city-states like Florence and Venice have developed a full-blown aesthetic economy. There, beauty isn't just a feminine duty, it's a civic virtue. You're expected to look pleasing because you represent your family, your husband, your father's trade. One scholar notes that merchants would sometimes invest in their daughters' beauty regimens as part of a larger strategy to improve their social standing. Cosmetic supplies were part of the dowry. In Venice, beauty manuals were copied and distributed in elite circles, complete with diagrams and strange concoctions involving crushed pearls, snail slime, or powdered coral. And every now and then, something new made the rounds, a French method, a Moorish tincture, a Greek balm said to erase years from the face. All untested, all potentially poisonous, all irresistible. Back in your chamber, the preparation is complete. Your maid smooths your veil. You rise. You thank her softly. And then you walk toward the door. Not because you want to be seen, but because you must be. There is a luncheon today. Someone important will be there. You take a deep breath. The Suze tingles slightly as it dries. You smile not too broadly, and you step into the hall radiant and hollow in equal measure. The hall buzzes before you even enter. Servants sweep past with trenchers of warm bread bowls of figs in syrup and roasted fowl crowned with sprigs of rosemary. Silver goblets glint in the candlelight. Nobles chatter softly behind jeweled hands, and the fire roars as if trying to outdo the velvet hush of privilege. You glide in not too fast, never too fast. Your every step, every glance is a calculated offering, because in this world you don't arrive. You appear, and appear you do in powdered skin and braided gold. You feel eyes land on you, appraising, measuring, perhaps admiring, perhaps comparing you to someone else. It doesn't matter, you've won their attention. For now. Because beauty, as they remind you without words, is not a state. It's a performance. And performances must be maintained. As you take your seat, you catch a glimpse of Lady Cecily across the table. Her hair is a pale flame golden from whatever alchemical ritual she's endured this month. Her brows are so faint they look like whispers. Her lips impossibly red leave small marks on her goblet. You nod, she nods, and the silent war continues. Historians still argue whether women of the era were active participants in these beauty competitions or merely trapped within them. But the letters, the manuals and the portraits say enough. The lengths to which they went were too deliberate to be passive. You shift slightly, adjusting your sleeves. Beneath them, you feel the tightness of your underdress, the faint itch of scented herbs sewn into the hem and the sting of old scratches where you plucked too aggressively last night. Let's talk about the fragrance of beauty, because looking good was only half the battle. In a world with limited bathing options and questionable sanitation, smelling pleasant was a full-time job. No one was expected to smell like sweat or soil or honest human life. Oh no, you were to smell like lilies, lavender honey, and spring rain, even in the middle of winter. Even after a 3-hour horse ride. Even after sitting beside a fire that smells like mutton fat and ash. How, with layers of scent masks, perfume gloves, pomanders, those tiny perforated orbs filled with spices and herbs hung from belts or tucked into bodices. Linen underthings soaked in rose water, necklaces strung with dried violets and thyme, veils that had been steeped in mint or crushed bay leaf. One curious recipe from a 14th century household manual suggests a rinse made of orange peel, crushed cinnamon and goat's milk to cleanse the scent of wickedness. What wickedness smells like isn't explained, but you'd know it if you smelled it, and worse, you'd be judged for it. One misstep, one waft of human scent, and the whispers would begin. She's not as pure as she seems. She must be ill. Did you hear she doesn't even use pomanders? The double standard was unrelenting. Men could return from hunts covered in horse and sweat and be called earthy. You smelled of anything less than a flower bed, and your entire moral character was questioned. It wasn't just about health. It was about virtue. One fringe theory even suggests that tales of saints whose bodies exuded sweet smells after death like Saint Clare or Saint Teresa helped reinforce this cultural obsession with mystic fragrance. If dead holy women could smell like violets, why couldn't you? Back in the hall, you shift your goblet. The man beside you, young, elegant, clearly important, leans closer. You smell like rosemary, he says with a soft half-smile. You laugh gently. Inside you think, yes, because I doused myself in it after scrubbing my hair with wine and cloves this morning while praying not to go bald. Out loud you murmur, just a little something from the apothecary, which is mostly true. It was actually something your maid learned from her grandmother, who once served in a house that served a duchess whose cousin knew a Venetian perfumer. It smells nice. It also stains your veils. You'll have to rewash everything tonight, but it was worth it. Because that one line from the young man, that might be the beginning of a connection, a story, a proposal, a future, sent like beauty with strategy. There's a saying whispered in the kitchens, a woman without fragrance is a door without a handle. No one remembers where it came from, but everyone repeats it, as if being unnoticed is worse than being unloved. You look across the room and see Lady Cecily again. She's laughing now. Her hair catches the firelight and she shines like a torch. Someone hands her a rose. You catch the faintest twitch in your own jaw. You don't hate her, but you don't trust her either, because in the medieval beauty economy, admiration is a zero-sum game. If they look at her, they don't look at you. And so you play your part, smile faintly, touch your veil, lower your gaze just enough to seem mysterious. Let the light find your cheekbone. Let the perfume rise from your collar. Let your silence become intrigue. And maybe, just maybe, someone will write a poem about you tonight. The poem, of course, is never promised, but it lingers, doesn't it? That flicker of hope nestled like a dried violet between the pages of a well-worn manuscript, The thought that someone someday might write a verse about you, not the real you, the version they saw from across the hall. Golden-haired, graceful, scented, silent. Because in the world you inhabit, women don't shape history through speeches or treaties. They do it through presence. You leave the banquet just before dusk, careful not to seem eager or flustered. The light outside has faded to that particular medieval grey-blue, neither day nor night, just a cold hush. You breathe it in as your maid unpins your veil and brushes the soothes from your cheeks. Your skin stings a little, but you felt worse. Tonight you'll apply a thick balm of goose-fat lavender and mashed bean pulp. It smells like despair but soothes like heaven. And tomorrow you'll do it all again. But before bed, let's talk about the cost of this performance. Not in coin though, that matted pigments and perfumes weren't cheap, but in health, in dignity, in freedom. One noblewoman in 14th century England reportedly went blind after getting bleach in her eyes while trying to lighten her hair. The court documents say her servants testified she had been attempting to resemble the Golden Lady in the Flemish tapestry. Whether that's true or just poetic exaggeration, no one's sure. Historians still debate how much truth lies in these anecdotes, but the patterns remain rash-covered foreheads, thinning scalps, peeling cheeks, and beneath it all, a quiet compliance. Because the alternative wasn't just invisibility, it was disgrace. In medieval Europe, especially among the aristocracy, a woman's reputation was her family's bargaining chip, her virginity a form of property, her appearance a symbol of piety or peril. One ill-timed glance in a garden could spark a rumor. One whisper of impropriety could dissolve an alliance, and so even the most minor deviation from the ideal became dangerous, not just socially but legally, physically. A girl with a sullied name might be disinherited, banished, even executed. You think of a girl you once knew, Mariette. Her family claimed she'd entertained a visiting knight. There was no proof, just gossip and a broken engagement. She disappeared shortly after. Some say she entered a convent. Others say the convent wouldn't take her. Some say she didn't go anywhere at all. So yes, when you stir your bleaching tonic under candlelight, you know the stakes. This isn't vanity. This is survival. And yet, despite the cruelty of it all, women found ways to resist. Some feigned holy innocence so convincingly they secured better dowries. Some faked virginity with herbs or minor surgical procedures. Some, like Hildegard of Bingen, turned to religion, channeling intellect and mysticism into power of a different kind. And some simply lived quietly on the edge, trading beauty secrets in kitchens and weaving rebellion into the folds of their veils. You smile thinking about it. In a world that asks you to vanish beneath perfection, even a wrinkle, a laugh, a glint of mischief is an act of defiance. Let's shift the lens, now zoom out just slightly. Across Europe, in merchant cities like Florence or Paris, beauty began to shape not just private lives, but public culture. Art, poetry, fashion, and even architecture began reflecting the ideal of the divine woman, pale blonde, fragrant, sorrowful. Painters gave their Madonnas golden halos and even more golden hair. Poets wrote of women who smelled like lilies even after a long ride. Even religious texts began to blur the lines between spiritual purity and physical perfection. You, of course, know the truth. The halo burns. The fragrance masks rot. The perfection, however poetic, is a prison. But you smile anyway. Because that's what you're meant to do. The irony is sharp, isn't it? That the very standards meant to elevate women, make them angelic, saint-like, above reproach, were designed by those who rarely had to suffer them. No bishop ever scalded his scalp to achieve radiance. No poet ever rubbed goat urine into his beard for the sake of verse. Yet here you are, scalded, powdered, perfumed, and somehow still expected to be grateful. So tonight, as the fire dims and your chamber grows still, You remove the last of the paint from your face. You dip a cloth in cool rose water and dab gently, soothing each patch where beauty tried to make itself permanent. And for a fleeting moment, you see yourself in the polished metal mirror, raw, tired, but unmistakably human. Maybe not a poem, but definitely a story. The mirror fades as you slip into your nightdress. The fire pops quietly in the hearth, casting long shadows across the chamber walls, shadows that seem somehow softer than the daylight. You sit by the glowing embers, fingers still tingling from scrubbing off the suze and saffron paste. Your scalp itches faintly beneath your linen cap, the remnants of that day's ambition simmering against your skin. And here in this flickering quiet, you wonder, what did it really cost? Not the beauty itself, but the belief behind it. The myth that says you must suffer to be seen, that your value is tethered to your ability to resemble a waxen icon of virtue. It wasn't just you, of course. It was everywhere. Let's visit the courts of Burgundy for a moment, where noble women adorned their faces with dangerous concoctions. White lead vinegar, crushed pearls to achieve that ghost-pale complexion, adored by dukes and painters alike. One documented case from 1473 describes a young lady of Dijon who collapsed during a feast. Her face was so powdered that when she fainted, it cracked. Literally, fragments of dried paste flaked from her jaw like plaster from a fresco. Guests gasped. A servant reportedly muttered, "She broke her mask." Was it dramatic storytelling? Perhaps. But that phrase, "broke her mask," feels hauntingly accurate, because that's what beauty was in this world, a mask, carefully constructed, rigid, fragile, and constantly in danger of breaking. Some women resisted quietly. They left poems in the margins of cookbooks complaining about the sting of lemon on their cheeks. Others joked about how perfume couldn't hide the smell of marriage. A few even taught their daughters to smile politely at painters, then sneak away before sitting for the full portrait. You admire them, but most conformed. They had to, because medieval beauty wasn't a choice, it was a requirement, and not just for noble women. As the merchant class rose in cities like Venice and Bruges, middle-class women began adopting these standards too. Bleach recipes trickled downward, rose water grew scarce, cosmetics were smuggled, shared, whispered about like spells, appearance became currency, and if you didn't have the right look, you paid for it another way. Consider the tale of Elisabetta, a lace-maker's daughter in 15th century Florence. She was known for her auburn hair, bright, wild, utterly unfit for the ideal. Her mother saved for weeks to buy a small vial of saffron rinse. Elisabetta used it once. The sun baked her hair into a tangled mass that smelled like singed herbs for days. When she went to market, people laughed. The next time she wore a veil. Historians still argue whether this kind of shame was internalized or enforced. Was it society or self that did the damage? The truth is, it hardly matters. The result was the same. Pain became part of the process. Let's not forget the symbolism behind all this. Golden hair wasn't just pretty. It was a metaphor, a stand-in for purity, holiness, and delicate femininity. The perfect woman was a saint, not because she performed miracles, but because she looked like she might. Soft, shining, silent. Even the church played its part. While it condemned vanity, it paradoxically promoted an image of the Virgin Mary that aligned with elite beauty ideals, pale skin, golden hair, a gaze that never met yours directly. Art reinforced the myth. So did literature. In the poems of the troubadours, the blonde lady was always the object of desire. The brunette, often the seductress or the danger. This wasn't just colorism, it was moral mapping baked into the culture like honey into a communion wafer. You think again of Lady Cecily, of her flame-colored braids, of the way she tilted her chin at court today. She's perfect. and perhaps also exhausted. Because maintaining beauty in this era wasn't about pride, it was about performance under pressure. One historian describes it as chronic vigilance. Another calls it a slow, polite decay. We'll call it what it was: survival in silk. Back in your chamber, the candles have dimmed to stubs. Your maid is asleep by the door. The scent of crushed lavender clings faintly to the linens. You press a hand to your cheek. It's warm, tender, and a little raw. Tomorrow you'll rise again. Bathe with rose vinegar, comb rosemary oil into your hair, paint your face with just enough lead to hide the truth, but not so much that it burns. Because that's the line. Hide the truth, but don't let it kill you. Not yet. You close your eyes and think just for a moment what it would be like to walk into a room unpainted, unbleached, unperfumed, to sit-speak smile without wondering if someone is counting your freckles. You smile faintly, that you think would be the real miracle. The sun has not yet risen, but the coals still hold their breath. You wake slowly, your limbs reluctant, your scalp sore. In the dim hush of your chamber, the world feels suspended just for a moment between the script you must perform and the self you've hidden beneath it. You sit up listening to the familiar rustle of linen, the soft snore of your maid, the distant clang of someone fetching water from the well. The day has not yet begun, and yet it already waits for you. And so with practiced grace, you begin again. But before you pin back your hair or powder your face or reach for the vial of Suze, you let yourself linger here on the edge of honesty. Let's take a breath and ask the quiet question that hangs beneath centuries of paint and perfume and poetic expectation. What happens to the women who failed, who didn't bleach, who didn't bend, who didn't burn themselves into beauty? Sometimes they were simply ignored, unmarried, invisible, dismissed by painters and poets alike. Other times they were punished, branded as disobedient, suspicious, even dangerous. Medieval beauty wasn't just decorative, it was political, and deviation from that ideal could mark a woman as untrustworthy, rebellious, or worse, impure. The holy trifecta, pale, quiet, virginal, was more than an aesthetic. It was a moral contract. Break it, and you broke the spell, the illusion, the safety net. And yet, not every woman conformed. Some carved out quiet defiance. Others embraced roles that allowed more freedom: midwives, nuns, herbalists, scribes. Some found joy in simple anonymity, spinning thread, reading scripture, raising children far from the scrutiny of court. And a few were remembered, not for their cheekbones, but for their voices. Christine de Pizan, the first woman in Europe known to make her living as a writer, dared to question male-dominated histories. Julian of Norwich spoke of divine love in language both mystical and motherly. Hildegard of Bingen composed symphonies and treated illnesses and saw visions that refused to conform to any man's framework. None of them needed golden hair. Their beauty, if we must call it that, was made of different strands: wisdom, wonder, and the audacity to exist outside the mold. Historians still debate how widespread these outliers were. Were they exceptions or quiet harbingers of change? Maybe both. And maybe that's the point. The story of medieval beauty is not just about powders and pigments. It's a tapestry, delicate, flawed, stitched with pain and pressure, but threaded too with resistance, resilience, and the soft shimmer of agency. So you sitting now on the edge of your straw-stuffed mattress are part of that same tapestry. Whether your hair shines like summer wheat or curls in wild defiance of fashion. Whether your skin carries the kiss of the sun or the hush of moonlight. Whether you wear the veil or pull it off. You are here. You are enough. And as the light slips through the slats of your wooden shutters, soft and indifferent, you know this beauty is fleeting. But the self, the raw, aching, honest self, is something no powder can erase, no poem can fully capture. You rise, stretch, and let the morning take you. Maybe you'll reach for the rose water, maybe not. But either way, the world will go on. And so will you. And now, let the candle gutter low. Let the comb fall from your hand and rest against the folded cloth. Let your scalp stop stinging just for tonight. You've walked through palaces and powder rooms, touched the jars of lead and the bundles of rosemary, breathed in the perfume of saffron and the ache of history. You've worn the mask, yes, but you've also slipped it off, if only here in the quiet of this little story. You are not alone, not in your worry, not in your wondering, not in your weariness. Because for every whispered beauty manual that told women to burn bleach and bind, there were others who laughed softly behind closed doors, who rebelled in ribbons and rosemary, who knew the truth of a face without paint. So take this moment now and breathe. Let the warmth of the hearth melt through the centuries. Let the hush of the chamber, linen rustling, breath deepening, remind you that peace is not always found in perfection. Sometimes it's in the imperfection, the crack in the mask, the unwashed hair, the freckle never quite covered, that we find rest. You've made it through another tale, another night, another unraveling of a myth that tried to define too many too tightly. And here you are still. So let your eyes drift closed. Let the weight of expectation melt from your shoulders. Let the echo of powdered footsteps fade into the silence. Sleep at last as yourself, exactly as you are. Good night.